custom widget. I am familiar with the iOS standard widget A, so
Right.
I immediately know how to use it. And same thing with Android. Widget B, well, it is different than widget A, and that seems like more work. It really is a better experience. Those I think, those two reasons alone should be reason enough. But the real huge impact that not a lot of people think about is the maintenance concern.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm using a system standard component as an engineer. Sure, that got me to market faster, which is great. That's a big win.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as the platform updates and there are improvements, not just bug fixes, but also maybe slight improvements in functionality, maybe a little bit of a UI refresh, a little bit of an update there. That's work that your engineering team doesn't have to do. That's work that the platform engineering teams did for you. Mm-hmm. So those are huge, huge wins. And that's maybe one example. There's a lot more to unpack. But at the end of the day, you really need your designers to know the platforms.
I've seen it go the other way, too, where a designer has brought something custom to a developer. And while there might be a widget out there, for some reason, the developer just kind of stays mute and just assumes that this is a task that they've been told to do and don't turn around and say, well, have you seen the way this drop down normally works in iOS or Android? And let me show you how this works. I've seen the other side where a developer might just take this and say, like, that's how they want it. Go and make the code. How would you coach developers that are maybe they're getting designs that way and they know that there probably is a better or more standardized way to deliver these things, but what if they're intimidated to go back to the designer or the product owner or product manager and say, wait a second, like how would you coach somebody around that?
It's difficult, I think, as engineers because sometimes we as engineers feel like we need to follow the orders we're given, and other times we feel that we find that even when we advocate to have our voice heard a little bit more in the design process, not every stakeholder sees the value in that. So first and foremost, I'd say understand the team that you're in as an engineer and whether your challenge for integrating closely with designers is going to be just a you challenge where you need to develop those personal relationships and find the courage, and also evaluate what is important feedback for you to provide and what feedback is maybe just your own design opinion. So maybe that's your situation, or maybe your situation is you need to really clearly express to stakeholders the value from a budget standpoint of investing the budget and allowing you to collaborate closely with designers during the design process. I've received feedback from a lot of designers over the years that they work better like this, that they thrive on the constraints that we provide, that they love to find out from engineers what's possible that they might not have known about. They also love to hear feedback when they present an idea, like, I love that idea. Would this similar thing, which is dramatically easier to build, be comparable from an experience perspective? So once you get in there, once engineering gets kind of a wedge into the design process and is part of the conversation, everybody that I've talked to has really enjoyed it, but spinning up that flywheel of collaboration can be challenging.
In your experience, you've led a lot of teams in mobile development. What has been some of the tips and things that you've found success in coaching a mobile team in order to achieve their goals?
Communication is key, and I do think it makes sense to identify systemic forms of communication that can help to alleviate the need for large meetings. So, for example, what's your process around generating and tracking and changing requirements? All three of those components of a plan around requirements are key, and I think that the exact system that you use for requirements can and should vary between projects.
Sure.
So that's going to get you some of the way with communication. It'll never get you all the way. So having a very open and collegial atmosphere among your team where conversation is encouraged and also tamped down where you're spinning your wheels. I think that's really huge. One thing I've seen on mobile projects specifically is there's a much greater need than usual to know your strengths, to know where other people on your team's strengths lie, and to really listen to each other. And I think that's may be most obvious with iOS and Android, for example. You go talk to the Android person about the Android stuff, and you talk to the iOS person about the iOS stuff.
Yeah.
I think that not taking the time to appreciate the fact that no matter who you are on the team and no matter how much experience you have, there is someone else on that team that has more experience with a specific thing than you, and seeking that wisdom out and embracing it and elevating it. Without that kind of activity on a regular basis on a native mobile project, you're going to run into some worse outcome.
Kind of put it on par with traditional software development. You've got front end and back end engineers, but that's where mobile, I think, is so much more unique, because you usually don't have a PHP developer and a .NET developer developing in tandem. Sure, you have a person who's working on JavaScript, and then maybe somebody who's doing some sort of Sitecore implementation or something like that. And I think that is a known quantity in terms of how that communication and those handoffs and those things need to go. But like you're saying, it's very easy. I've found that an Android team and an iOS team can live in very separate silos and not communicate extremely well. So what I hear you saying is that I think that's key for a successful dual build, right?
Absolutely. One of my favorite PMs I've ever worked with, Mike Richards, he's done a fair amount of native mobile work, including with me and without me. And he and I were riffing on native mobile project management or product management. And I was asking him, I was like, so is this really different than other kinds of projects? And if so, how? And his response is he doesn't feel it's really necessarily different than other software projects. Native mobile projects have a tendency to blow up the chinks in your armor. So if you and I want to make sure, again, not to downplay, you really do need people that have experience with native mobile if you're going to run a native mobile project successfully. That said, if you're running large complex software projects and all your ducks are in a row, you're probably going to have an okay time with a native mobile project. Whereas if you had some speed bumps in your process, or maybe some opportunities to have better collaboration, or to move more efficiently, or to not miss requirements, a native mobile project, because of the nature of the fact that the team is wider and more parallel, is just going to blow all those little multipliers up.
Where do you see some of the best opportunities these days for mobile developers in terms of growing what they do?
Yeah, that's a question I spend a lot of time thinking about. Again, I'm passionate about education, so I'm always trying to help out people that are new. I think you can tell that I voted with my feet in that I'm working with the Nerdery Client Services Organization for years now. I think that especially early in your career, that is one of the better places you can end up. And the reason is just you get the diversity of work that comes along with freelancing, and you get the stability and the support network that comes with working with a mature software organization.
If I'm that new developer, what is some of the advice you would give me as I was taking on my first project? What are some of the things that you would coach them on? Like, here's Patrick's top 3 things you should pay attention to as you start on your first development project within a team.
Yeah. Picking only 3.
Well, within reason.
Yeah, I think it really depends on where you're coming from. Really high level, because if I was only going to pick 3 things, it would have to be really high level. First, be honest with yourself about where you're at, and honest could be
with your skill set,
exactly, and and knowledge base and experience.
Sure,
and that can be acknowledging that you should really be reading iOS Weekly and Android Weekly and up on what the global scene's doing. Or it can be being honest about maybe you have a little bit of imposter syndrome that you're struggling through.
Sure.
And you can look at your portfolio and see you've made some really great work. So I would say first be honest with yourself about your skill set and your background, and double down on your strengths and fill in your gaps. The second thing is really try hard to understand who your client, for whatever definition of client you want, what your client wants. Let's say my client, I'm in a client services organization, and we get some designs. And again, back to your earlier example, there's a widget that is not system standard in there, and there's a system standard widget that will be faster to build, more familiar with users, and
better long term.
Exactly. So now your responsibility is to understand that what your client wants is not for you to pixel perfect match that spec. What your client wants is probably, conversions, revenue,
Right.
happy users, a shorter timeline, a smaller budget, right? Higher quality. So really try hard to understand at a high level those things, and also in the weeds, like for this specific project, what is motivating my client?
I'm a UX designer, and I'm going to be designing my first mobile application, and it's dual. It's for iOS and for Android. If you were to sit down with that person when they are getting started, what are some of the things that you would tell them to pay attention to as they're designing for a cross-platform application?
Yeah, it really depends on who I'm talking to. Yeah, it's definitely one of those know your audience situations. So, for example, I like to just do a check initially with the designers I'm working with and ask, are they familiar, and I mean really familiar, with the specifics throughout of the HIG, the Human Interface Guidelines for iOS, and the spec, the Material Design Guidelines for Android. And if the answer is no to either of those, then that is step 0.
Yep. We got some work to do.
Right. Oh, and yeah, it's work. And those can be difficult conversations to have, because often if I'm working with a designer, they're incredible. They're just a great designer, and the gap in their skill set around native mobile doesn't change the fact that they're a great designer. I've got a job to do, though, and that's to ensure the quality of the product, which means we do need to have some maybe challenging conversations. Right? I ask them what their background is, and then maybe in conversation I point out when I think there's room for constructive feedback on designs I'm starting to see roll out. I'm like, hey, notice this link to this specific section of the guidelines that solves this problem for you maybe a little bit more easily. You reinforce that a few times, and normally designers are game for, my life's going to be a lot easier if I do my homework first.
Where do you see the future of mobile development going, and maybe not necessarily the immediate future, but maybe a year out, 2 years out?
Yeah, I love these kinds of questions. I love to think on the horizon.
Yeah, let's do that.
So I can say React Native, there's definitely a lot of excitement that I'm hearing around that as well. Xamarin has really proven itself useful in certain circumstances. It has its place, and its place is not everywhere. Advice for engineers out there that are native mobile, Android or iOS, that are maybe hesitant to even look into things like React Native or Xamarin, I would caution that they become students of history and think about the fact that there have been plenty of Flash developers, for example, that never wanted to move on from Flash, and eventually everyone else moves on from Flash, and whether or not you're late to the party is up to you. I can say probably for business stakeholders that cross-platform solutions are definitely something that should be considered. Yeah, and jumping to a conclusion one way or another, that's a very big decision. Yeah. You want well-informed people that can offer some very grounded counsel on these kinds of topics.
I mean, in my experience, the closer you want to get to the hardware, the more you have to go native, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I guess it depends is the answer for everything in engineering, isn't it? If you want the 2-word answer for everything.
Not on this show, Patrick.
I know, right?
On this show, we give definitive answers. Okay. And history be damned.
Yeah.
No, honestly, I think it depends is absolutely correct, right? But you've been doing this a long time. I would trust your opinion on what you've seen work and not work.
In my mind, there's 3 paths forward. If you know you need an app and you're not sure if that should be an iOS and Android app, the first option would be native iOS, native Android. The second option would be a cross-platform native solution. And the third would be web app, progressive web app, some flavor of web app. Mm-hmm. The way that you'll make that decision between those 3 tiers is going to be what's important to you. If budget is super important to you and all the bells and whistles that you get with a native mobile app are not super important to you, then you're going to land on a web app, right? And if somewhere in between is where you're at, you're probably going to end up on a cross-platform solution. So say, for example, I'm producing internal-only resource for filling out forms. It needs to be native mobile and needs to have persistence layer and maybe a little bit of Bluetooth functionality, maybe. And that